Welcome to Charity Village Connects. I'm Mary Barrell. Recently, there have been many reports about alarming challenges facing the nonprofit sector, including unprecedented demand for services and falling donations. Other reports point to donors' economic situations and larger sociological shifts as the cause for the downward trend in donations. We're taking the pulse of fundraising for nonprofits in 2024 and looking ahead to major trends that will impact the sector in the future. Joining me to discuss these important issues and her own report, State of the Legacy Nation, is Charlotte Field, a fundraiser and digital native with more than a decade of experience in communications and fundraising. As a partner at Good Works, she's worked with charities of all sizes and causes to raise funds from annual and legacy donors. Charlotte is a co-author of You Can't Take It With You, The Art and Science of Legacy Fundraising. Welcome to the podcast, Charlotte.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm really excited.
Well, can you talk a little bit about the State of the Legacy Nation report, its methodology, and why you put this report together?
Absolutely. So this is the fourth iteration of the State of the Legacy Nation. So the first one was done back in 2010 by my partner Fraser Green, and he basically was at CAGP. He was sitting in sessions, and he was thinking to himself, "Why can't we use direct mail to market legacy giving to your everyday?" Ordinary Canadian donor, and that's sort of where it all began. So that was the first State of the Legacy Nation, and this being the fourth one. Our last one before this was in 2019. So we're getting a really interesting sort of pre and post pandemic look at legacy giving. We work with Environics to poll 1,500 Canadians. We focus on English speaking Canadians because we found in past reports that there is a significant difference in the giving motivation and behavior of French speaking Canadians. And so our data is specific to English speaking Canada, and it's a representative sample. So it basically mirrors the demographics, age, and gender of overall Canada within that little subset of 1,500 people. And it's polled online. When we started State of the Legacy Nation, it was very much about, making the case for this type of giving, this approach to legacy giving, which was pretty innovative at the time to be targeting your everyday annual donors. Now we see fundraisers who've really bought in. They've drunk that Kool-Aid. They're on board, and it's really about being able to show, here's what the potential looks like. Here are some of the benchmarks that I can maybe use to model for my organization what we might want to be investing or where there's opportunity, and very much about taking the temperature of the landscape. How have things changed? How might we need to be pivoting? So State of the Legacy Nation is a product that we're really proud of here at GoodWorks, and has a lot of value, we think, to the sector.
Well, you break out your report by generational cohort. What are the reasons for doing this, and what disadvantages are there in this model, if any, when it comes to interpreting the data?
Sure. I mean, there's one core disadvantage with doing it this way, and that's that you lose intersectionality. Whenever you group a large group of people together by a single variable, you lose intersectionality, you lose complexity and layer and nuance. So yes, we take everything by cohort specifically, and we know that there is some loss there. We know that the lived experience of one Canadian with a certain background, a certain experience, a certain variety of factors is very different from another. However, the reason we continue this way is twofold. One is that our past legacy nations have been grouped this way, and so it enables easier comparison. The bigger reason, though, is that legacy giving, more so than any other type of giving, is very driven by life stage. You've got to be in what Jane Fonda calls the third act of life. So that later stage of your life where you are reflecting on the life you've led, you're writing that final chapter. You don't get there until you're where our baby boomers and our civics are now. And because legacy giving is so predicated on that life stage, that's what neuroscience tells us. That's what the work of Russell James tells us. We do continue to use cohorting to divvy up our data in State of the Legacy Nation because it's so critical to understand how you market to a millennial versus a boomer is so integral based on how high is their death avoidance, what's their interest in legacy giving, and then how are you going to action that from a marketing perspective.
Makes perfect sense to me. I'd love to hear what the current snapshot of legacy giving is in Canada. Does it make up a large portion of fundraising dollars?
It does. In fact, based on our math, we're looking at about 19% of all money given to charities coming through gifts in wills based on this year's report. The landscape itself is a really positive and promising one. We have more people who have made wills in Canada than we had 4 years ago. More than half of Canadians now. We had 42% of Canadians having made wills back in 2019. That's up to 52%. So, right there, your target audience of high quality prospects just grew by 10%. Incredible news. We have more people who've left gifts in their wills. That's up by 500,000 Canadians. Up to 2 million Canadians have already left gifts in their wills, or they're planning to do so in the next 5 years. We are estimating that the value of that marketplace, the value of that pipeline is in the area of $280 billion. Again, up from 216 back in 2019. So there's a lot to like here. We have more people are making wills. The value of these gifts is extraordinary. There are a huge number of people who are planning to make wills. So that pipeline is still strong, still moving. There were some questions about, are we over that wealth transfer coming from the civics? And the resounding answer is no. The baby boomers are still very much in play, and they're still moving gifts along in a substantial way. And more than that, what we see is that legacy giving seems to be a very stable type of giving. The past 4 years have been uncertain for nonprofits and charities, to say the least, and yet legacy has been, because it's so values based, so inherent, and also because it doesn't tend to be impacted as much by the day-to-day pressures of things like inflation, interest rates, cost of living. It doesn't seem to have the same volatility as other giving types. So there's a lot of stability in legacy giving.
That's very interesting. Well, there's nothing like a pandemic, a global pandemic, to raise the number of wills that are drawn up, certainly among Canadians. That must logically follow. Were there any surprises this year? Anything that has shifted from previous years other than the increased that you saw?
Yes, well, I mean, you hit the nail on the head. I mean, certainly you do see the impacts of COVID there. You see the impact of the reactive will maker. Our research found in a different report, not the State of the Legacy Nation, but in 2022, we did a piece of research called Changing Tides, and we found that 10% of all Canadian wills had been made in the past 2 years, and another 20% had been updated. So there's a lot of impact of COVID there. And we see that here in State of the Legacy Nation, again, with that expanded universe of will makers. Certainly, it's exciting to see more than half of Canadians having wills based on our research. What's really interesting is that as the size of the audience of will makers has risen, the percentage of people who are leaving gifts in wills has actually decreased. That can sound really scary to fundraisers. We actually think that there's enormous promise here because we have a good idea of what's happening there. But it is an interesting inversion to see more wills, conceivably a lesser ratio of gifts in them.
Very interesting. So, how do people with wills generally divide up their bequest? Is there a pattern or an average amount that's commonly left to charities? Can you tell that?
Well, we have anecdotal data in insofar as the average amount of a bequest. We use $35,000. That's what we see most typically across our clients. It varies enormously. In healthcare, it tends to be quite a bit more. For social services, tends to be more like in the $15,000, $20,000 range. So the benchmark is one of those ones that varies really wildly within the sector. And so we really encourage organizations when they're doing modeling, if at all possible, to model based on your own benchmarks. That's the best thing to do because it changes so much. But 35,000 tends to be where we start for the most part. In terms of how assets get allocated, the most common place has always been, continues to be children and spouse. So this year's research found that 62% of people who leave gifts in, or who are managing their estate planning, are leaving assets to children. 57% are leaving assets to the spouse. No surprise there. That's long been one of the most common barriers in legacy marketing, is that challenge of, but what about my children? But what about my family? And that's why we often talk about residual giving as a vehicle that has a lot of pickup, because donors from our focus groups, we know that they really resonate with this idea that, the people that I love the most will be cared for. I can feel confident in that. And then I can give whatever is left over to a charity that I care about. The added bonus being that typically a residual gift is substantially larger than a fixed sum, for example. So everybody kind of wins. The donor can feel really confident about something that can sometimes feel uncertain. What's the size of your estate going to be? Not too sure. But also the charity can really benefit. So the other thing that's interesting about that, though, is we like to sort of flip the statistic and think about, okay, also 38% of people who leave gifts and wills don't have children. A greater percentage than that even don't have a spouse. So it's easy to think, well, for the most part, people who leave gifts and wills, the charity is priority 3 or 4 or 5. But for a large percentage of these people, those two biggest directions, the child and the spouse, are actually not in play. And that tracks with what we've historically seen, that your best legacy prospect has been female and unmarried. So that pattern continues to be in play here. We know based on this year's research that about 10% of will makers are telling us they leave a gift in their will to charity. And it's worth noting that when we do our research, we split apart charitable giving and giving to religious institutions. CRA and Statistics Canada group those together, but we have found that the psychology of a gift in a will to a charity is very, very different from a gift in a will to a religious institution. And so we split those apart. Giving to charities was a lesser percentage, giving to the church or a religious institution was a lesser percentage overall than giving to charity, which clocked in at about 10% this year.
So anyway, this is all really, really fascinating, and certainly data that I've never heard before. So I'm quite intrigued. Um, you did mention that the percentage of people making wills in Canada has gone up, but the number of charitable bequests and wills has gone down, other than the residual bequests that you've mentioned. Can you provide some insight into what's happening here about the number of charitable bequests and wills going down? Should this be a concern to fundraisers, especially when you're setting out your strategies and moving forward on building out your legacy giving plan?
Yeah, it's an interesting phenomenon here, and there's sort of two pieces. So, what we've seen, to be clear, is that the percentage of people who have a will in Canada has increased. The percentage of people with a will who leave a gift in that will has decreased. We think that there's two things going on here. The other thing that's sort of worth being aware of is that 10% number, so 10% of people with gifts and wills include a gift to charity in their will, is in line with our State of the Legacy Nations from 2010 and 2014. In 2019, that jumped up to 17%. It's possible that 2019 was just an outlier, and that what we're seeing here is a return is more accurate to the trend. But we don't think that's actually what happened for two reasons. One is that we can account for why there are so many more wills in Canada, and we can account for why proportionally there would be fewer gifts. Why would there be more wills in Canada? COVID. That's plain and simple the answer. I mentioned before that 10% of wills in this country were created literally in the past 2 years. Those were created in large part by your Gen X and your millennial donor, and they were motivated by fear. These were not motivated by people who are looking at their lives, reflecting on their purpose, their value, the meaning behind, 60, 70, 80 years, and thinking, how do I want to be remembered? How would I like to, what's the kind of world I want to leave behind? This was people in their late 30s, 40s, early 50s. The oldest Gen Xer is about 57, and the youngest millennial is about 34. And these are people going, I have a mortgage, I have kids, and it feels a lot like the world is ending. I better put a will in place. So these were not people who were about to leave gifts and wills, but they made a lot of wills. So that explains why we have this big increase in the number of wills in Canada. But not very few of those brand new wills had gifts in them. So they weren't being made by people who were experiencing a high level of legacy readiness. At the same time, when you look at the wills that are likeliest to have gifts in them, those are wills from people who are in that third act of life, right? Those are also the people, unfortunately, who were the likeliest to be impacted by the excess mortality of COVID. 79% of COVID deaths are unfortunately people who were over the age of 70. Those were your likeliest bequesters. And now those people are no longer gifts and wills, those are realized gifts. And so you see the proportion of gifts and wills shrink while the number of wills increases. So we have a good understanding of why that would have happened. And to us, there's a huge amount of opportunity here. So you've got your baby boomers, about a third of them, 35%, based on our research, still don't have wills. So these are your people who are lower on death avoidance being that concept, the neurological concept pioneered by Russell James, which basically talks about as you age, you become more comfortable talking about death. It feels more eminent to you. Whereas when you're younger, your brain will do anything it can to not think about that in the context of your own life. We all know we're going to die, but nobody's really like thinking about that actively until you get to that third act of life. So a third of people in that third act don't yet have a will. So will you, as a charity, be able to get into that first will? Two-thirds of those people have wills, and we know that they're likely to update them. On average, Canadians update their wills 3 times in their lives. So that tends to happen in relation to a change in life circumstance, a birth of a grandchild, the death of a spouse, a downsize. These are things that tend to happen in the third act of life. So when those baby boomers go to their lawyer and they say, I just had a beautiful grandbaby, I want to update my will, I want to make sure they're provided for. Oh yeah, and I just had really wonderful cancer treatment at my community hospital, and I want to include a gift. When that change in life circumstance happens, will you be top of mind as a charity? And then last but not least, we have these wild card reactive will makers that are unlike anything we've ever seen before. They have the will, they've got that piece of the puzzle in place. So there's a huge barrier there that's gone away. They don't have to make a will, they can just update it. But what are they going to look like when you're looking at, 25 to 55 years before gifts in those wills realize if they're made today? And many of those wills don't have gifts in them yet. We're waiting for people to get to that later stage of legacy readiness. So they totally changed the game in terms of how you market legacy giving. This is a long game for those people. This is many, many years. This is decades of investment and cultivation and drip marketing to make it into that will. So there's a huge amount of opportunity here. When you look at that first percentage, that shift in ratio, you think, oh my God, that's not good news. But actually, the news is overwhelmingly good, because as the number of will makers is growing, that's a greater number of people for whom the barrier is lowered for you to be doing that work as a charity, doing that legacy marketing, gripping in the legacy messaging over a long period of time, so that when someone goes to their lawyer with that update, they go, oh yeah, I also wanted to do this.
That's really, really interesting. Are organizations doing enough, do you think? I mean, generally, to encourage legacy giving amongst their donors and supporters? It, it's such a fantastically interesting way that you're describing in terms, it's almost a science, like understanding that this is not a situation where the glass is half empty, it's really half full, because they'd already taken the steps to draft those wills, and all you got to do is convince them to make an amendment to it. Um, are do you think that nonprofits, leaders of nonprofits, and their fundraising professionals really understand or are doing enough to communicate this to their donors?
It's an interesting topic, and I think it's one of those things that, we all know as fundraisers that you could always do more, but a huge piece of what tends to hold legacy giving back is staffing and capacity. Do you have someone who can administer these gifts when they're made? All of those pieces are very critical, but a core tenet of our philosophy at GoodWorks is that, these are ordinary gifts made by extraordinary donors, and that philosophy you can absolutely extrapolate to any charity of any size. So if you are an organization that's doing important work, that has loyal donors who are committed to giving to you, whose values align with yours, then there's a legacy giving opportunity for you. There's $280 billion that's already been gifted in wills, sitting in the pipeline right now. That's going to be trickling into charities in the next 10, 15 years. There's another $56 billion coming down the pipeline. Are you going to get it? What's the most important or the biggest recommendation I would make here is about proactivity in your legacy marketing, and focus not on just uncovering intentions, but on moving the needle. So it's very easy to say, we're going to do a campaign, we're going to do a mailing, or we're going to do a phone campaign, and we're going to, call up a subset of folks that we think probably have left gifts in their world, and we're going to ask them if they did. And that's all well and good. You can absolutely do that. And that's a wonderful idea. If it's your first time doing this, you might skim the cream off your file and be really delighted with your results. If this is your seventh or eighth time, you might find that your results are starting to dwindle. But what you're really doing, if you do that, is more than anything, you're covering people who had made a gift and then you just didn't know about it. Whereas if you move to a more proactive approach, at GoodWorks we call it the legacy factory approach. This idea of moving people along the process from lead to suspect to prospect to donor, and then all the cultivation work that goes in there, you're actually moving people. You're starting them here at, oh, I've never thought about that before, to very carefully over a period of years through very intentional drip marketing using an autobiographical approach. So you're really holding up the mirror through your marketing to your prospects and saying, here's a person who looks and feels a lot like you. They share your values, they share your life experience, they're committed to this cause. And hey, did you know they left a gift in their will? I wonder if that would be interesting to you. You do that work over a long period of time, you create a strong connection in the mind of the donor between their values and beliefs, your work, and gifts and wills, and you start to actually move people into making that gift. You do that persuasive heavy lifting. So that's my biggest recommendation is as much as you can be building a system and structures that are persuasive and active. So you're really stewarding people along that legacy journey. And by the same token, it's really important to have this understanding that legacy gifts you cannot expedite them. Those happen on the donor's time, on their timeline. So that's why it's so important to be doing that really consistent, constant, respectful marketing. Again, so that when that life change happens, you're top of mind. You're never going to convince someone to go book time with their lawyer, pay that money, and put a gift in their will. That just doesn't happen. But when that change happens, have you done the heavy lifting to be top of mind? That's the biggest thing that you can do right now in order to harness all that potential that's coming down the line.
It may be somewhat of a common misperception that legacy giving programs are really only for the large organization. You mentioned very briefly early on that, it could be applied to both small and larger organizations, but surely this takes a level of professionalism in fundraising that some of the smaller organizations might struggle with. Is that a fair characterization?
Well, the trickiest thing in many ways comes down to the way that these gifts are administered. There's a big difference between administering one-time gifts and handling estate planning. There's a lot of implications there. That's where bodies like CAGP, the Canadian Association of Gift Planners, are invaluable to fundraisers who are looking at a planned gift that just came in the door going, I don't know what to do with this. Um, but does that mean that any charity of any size can't market gifts and wills? Absolutely not. As I said, these are values-based gifts. So if you have donors who care about you, you can market gifts and wills. More than anything, the biggest indicator for legacy success for most charities tends not to be purely their size, but their loyalty and their history. So we know that the biggest indicator for legacy giving that we have is more than anything loyalty. People who have been giving for many, many years are more likely to include you in their will. So if you're a nonprofit that's very new and you don't have a lot of loyalty in your database, you're going to have a harder time because you don't have that wonderful foundation of loyalty to build on. It's not to say you can't do it. It means that you're not going to have all that beautiful cream to skim as if you are, a 67-year-old charity with a big database. So the more loyalty you have behind you, the easier it's going to be to drive that legacy marketing forward. But any charity of any size really can pursue legacy marketing. It does require, as you say, that administrative side, that back end that is a little bit more robust. And that's where an organization like CAGP can be instrumental. Building your connections with lawyers, with accountants, with estate planners is integral as well, so that not only are those professionals, those allied professionals, mentioning you in their discussions with clients potentially, but they're also able to support you and you start to know them really well. They can help you out if you have a question. So there's great resources out there if you're a smaller charity and you want to be a part of this, but you're thinking this seems like it's out of my wheelhouse.
So, what do you think the future potential of legacy giving is in Canada? Is it expected to grow or decrease with different kind of generations or the generational cohorts that you've been studying?
Sure. Well, in the next 5 years, based on our research, 35% of Canadians who don't yet have a will are telling us that they're expecting to make one in about the next 5 years. So we're going to continue to see that audience of will makers expand. And that's not to mention people who are going to update their wills. So based on that 35% of people, if they continue to give at the rate we've historically seen. So what we've typically seen is that people leave, they name four gifts or four charities in their will, and the average request is $35,000. If 35% of those non-will makers do make gifts, you're looking at another 56 billion in that legacy pipeline. Again, that's not $56 billion that gets realized in the next 5 years. It's $56 billion that gets put into wills. And then there's a cultivation work that goes into realizing that gift remaining in the will. So there's that piece. Sorry, go ahead.
No, no, please continue.
So there's that piece of the puzzle. And then, of course, there is all of that potential hiding in our reactive will makers. Those 10% of brand new wills that came out of COVID are due for updates in the coming years. Wills number 2 and 3. What is going to happen with those? So there's a huge amount of opportunity there. What it's going to really mean, though, is there's going to be an evolution in the way that we market legacy gifts. Historically, we have really leaned into that sort of symbolic immortality messaging, that idea of living beyond the death of your body, living through the values that you live, the way that you want to leave behind the world. But when we're talking about marketing to millennials and Gen X, that's going to look a little bit different. And Statistics Canada just released a report, I think yesterday or a couple of days ago. There are now more millennials in Canada than there are boomers. So there's sort of two prongs that we're going to need to have for really effective legacy marketing. One is continuing to pursue those boomers um, who have wills or who don't, but who are likely to realize their bequests sooner. And then doing the long-term marketing that it's going to take to get into the millennial and the Gen X will. And that's also going to mean changing up not just our creative, but some of our tactics, even our giving vehicles. So we know, for example, that Gen X and millennials are a lot likelier to do substantial online research before they make a gift in their will. That makes perfect sense. And yet, so many charities, if you look at their legacy web content, it's buried and hard to find. It uses a huge amount of jargon. It's very executional. So it's very much, here are all the details, and here's the question for your estate planner. Even sometimes the most basic pieces of information that we need in order to put a gift in a will is the organization's name, the charity's legal name, their charitable registration number, and their address. The amount of times that that's hard to find on a website is incredible. And there are real stories of charities who do not get gifts because that information wasn't available. So, like, don't be that charity, don't be the cautionary tale. Please put that information in places that are front and center. I did a piece of research back in 2019 that was everything you've ever wanted to know about legacy websites. And we did qualitative surveying, we did heat mapping, and we basically looked at how do people get to legacy websites and or web content, and then what do they do when they get there. We found that 70% of people get there through search. So they basically get there on purpose. They don't, nobody is stumbling upon these places. There are very few people comparatively. And then the way that they behave is very specific. They're looking for a lot of inspiration and persuasive information, and then they're looking for contact information. So right out of the gate, there's huge opportunity to get your legacy web content up to par and where it needs to be to speak to these people. That's your foundation of an online program. And then starting to look at other more integrated ways to build your pipeline. We're doing Facebook ads these days to fill the pipeline for more mature legacy programs. Are you using direct mail as effectively as you can? We know that 75% of direct mail donors are direct mail donors are legacy interested or legacy responsive. So your direct mail file is an incredibly high quality legacy prospect file. Are you mailing them? Are you mailing them legacy information? Are you doing that on a regular basis so that you are, again, building that strong connection between a gift and a will and your charity and that donor? So having that shift towards a more integrated approach will be critical, particularly with these younger donors, these Gen X and millennial donors. And then starting to think about how we're going to shift the messaging to better speak to the psychology of these groups. They tend to be more scarcity minded, they tend to be more worried, and they're at a stage in their life where right now this isn't something they're quite ready for. But they will be, and it will happen sooner than you think. Again, that oldest Gen Xer is 57. They're not far off that third act. So the organizations that are going to fare the best in the next 10, 20, 30 years are the ones who invest now, do that proactive work on top of.
Hmm. Well, let's wrap up with your thoughts about future giving in Canada. Are you optimistic that generosity in terms of legacy giving will continue in the coming years? It sounds like you are actually quite positive about the potential growth there.
Absolutely. I mean, the reality is that the motivators that drive legacy giving are in many ways intrinsic to all of us. It's just about, these ebbs and flows in population, and all of the data would tell us that that next wave is well on its way in terms of, the baby boomer wealth transfer still very much in play. And then Gen X and millennials are working hard to sort of take over, and from a population perspective, they're there. So now it's just about doing that cultivation over the long term. The keys for organizations are going to be making sure that they have the marketing in place, and then making sure that they're ready. Do you have the back end in place? Do you have things like a moves management system so that when you're doing that persuasive work, you can actually tell how much did I move the needle? Do you have people who know how to administer those gifts? Do you have enough of them? And then the other key thing that I think that we're beginning to see is more diversity in terms of the types of giving vehicles that people are interested in. Historically, we've talked almost exclusively about gifts and wills. That's 90 to 95% of planned gifts in Canada. And we talk about them because they're easy. In our donor focus groups, donors liked them because they're super easy to understand. They're not complicated, as opposed to things like charitable remainder trusts. People think like, oh my God, that's really complicated. That's not for me. That's for the very wealthy. Again, if we're talking about your everyday average donor, with these younger donors, we're starting to see a big upswing in things like gifts of life insurance, things that have less of a death avoidance trigger, that enable you to make an impact both now and later. So starting to explore other giving vehicles as well is going to be really critical. But the opportunity is very much there. The data spells it out. In the next 5 years, another 56 billion coming into the pipeline. Years to come, that's going to continue. So all the opportunity is there. It's just about how you harness it.
Well, Charlotte, I want to thank you for this really fascinating report and your expertise and insights. I mean, I've learned a great deal in this past half hour, and it's truly fascinating. I'm looking forward to learning more about this really critical part of fundraising in Canada. I know that all of your advice and your insights will be so appreciated by our podcast audience. So thank you for joining Charity Village Connects.
Thank you. It's been my absolute pleasure. And as you can tell, I could totally talk about this stuff for hours and hours. So I appreciate you letting me ramble and rant about legacy giving. It's one of my favorite things.
Well, it's truly fascinating and really important. So thank you.
Thank you.